Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, as the US bars Ethiopia, Guinea and Mali from accessing duty-free American produce available through the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act over alleged human rights violations, what more needs to be done in the continent and across the diaspora to ensure the bloc recovers from the economic slowdown caused by the coronavirus pandemic? Bolaji Shofoluwe, the managing director of the ETK Group, will be joining me here in the studio for her take. And I'll also be joined by the chairman of the British Africa Business Alliance, David Smith, who'll be joining me from Macclesfield. Then later, I'll be looking back at some of the biggest company news stories of the week. But first, as always, let's start the show with business news from here in the UK, where disjointed COVID restrictions across the 4 devolved nations remain a major topic of discussion. Prime Minister Boris Johnson's decision to not step up measures already in place in England has been met with opposition after the UK reported over 220,000 new infections in the country earlier in the week. The Prime Minister insists that England can withstand a surge in infections without shutting down the economy.
Together with the Plan B measures that we introduced before Christmas, we have a chance to ride out this Omicron wave without shutting down our country once again. We can keep our schools and our businesses open, and we can find a way to live with this virus. But the weeks ahead are going to be challenging, both here in the UK and across the world. There is no escaping the fact that some services will be disrupted by staff absences.
Well, earlier I spoke with our business correspondent Simon Pusey for some analysis. Simon, slow start to the new year. I think lots of observers expected the Prime Minister to immediately put restrictions in place in England. That hasn't happened. Should we expect some new measures?
I think maybe a little bit of tinkering, but Boris Johnson just in the last few hours has come out and says he doesn't want to put any new restrictions in at the moment. He wants to ride out, he uses those words, this current wave of Omicron. And I think there's a little bit of scientific evidence that that might be a good thing to do, but then also quite a lot of science that could suggest the opposite, as is always the way with this. He says he would rather stick with Plan B, but he has acknowledged that parts of the NHS will become overwhelmed. And just at the moment, we're seeing that about 10% of NHS staff are off right now at the moment, but some NHS trusts, one has 750 staff that are off in one day. So it really does depend. And I think there's been quite a few NHS trusts that have announced a sort of emergency within their departments because of a lack of staff, and most of that is due to COVID. The numbers do suggest that things are going in the right direction in some ways. For example, the week ending the 24th of December, there was a fall in the number of deaths. They decreased to 585. That was down from 753 the previous week. Obviously, the reporting of these deaths, though, and they take a couple of weeks to come about, and obviously Christmas, and then you had New Year, and you had a lot of people mixing in those times. So we're actually probably likely to see those numbers rise in the next few days and weeks. One thing I think people will find interesting is the government is considering changing travel rules when people come back from other countries. At the moment, you've got this sort of 3-tiered approach where you have to be double vaccinated. You also then have to book a test at the airport and be negative for that before you get on the plane. And then you need to book this other test that you then do a couple of days later, and you had to fill in your passenger locator form. It's very complicated. Travelling around Europe and in other countries is a breeze compared to coming back to the UK. A lot of people within the travel industry here saying this makes no sense now that so many people in the UK have this Omicron variant, that making it so hard to actually come to this country doesn't make any sense. And I think the government, a few ministers today have been briefing, saying they're looking at changing that to make it a little easier to come back to the UK, and also a little cheaper, because obviously those PCR tests cost quite a lot of money. So I think people will be interested in that, and I think just making that a little bit more commonsensical and also cheaper will be good. Also, the lateral flow tests, there's been some information out that these are actually a lot more accurate than they once were. So again, ministers are thinking of, if you test positive on a lateral flow test, it doesn't mean you then need to book a PCR, whereas at the moment that is the advice, is that you need to go and get a PCR, which is at the moment around £50, can be quite expensive. But it looks like it's so accurate now, these lateral flow tests, that will be enough. And I think going forward we will see the technology will get so good that when you want to go into venues or you want to have a quick test, those lateral flow tests will start to become the norm. So no big sort of announcements from the government. Obviously, Labour wants testing, there to be more testing available. There's been a shortfall in the last few weeks. But the Labour Party are pretty much with the government on what we're doing at the moment. There's no big things that Keir Starmer is coming out and saying, and actually he has COVID at the moment. So
again,
he has COVID for a second time. Yeah, exactly. So. So it's business as usual, really. And I think, like I said last week, a lot of this is political. Boris Johnson has people within his own party that doesn't want more lockdowns. He doesn't want to restrict people's freedoms anymore. So I think as much as health is politics.
Thank you, Simon. Let's change gear now and focus on Africa's economic expansion in the coming year. Last weekend, America cut Ethiopia, Mali and Guinea from accessing their duty-free trade programme, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, over alleged human rights violations. The move is considered a major blow to some of the milestones the continent has been able to overcome in the past few years over security concerns. Before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the 6 most dynamic economies in the world were African, but after over 2 years of health restrictions, countries that depend mainly on oil and tourism have paid a heavy price. Earlier, I spoke with the managing director of the ETK Group, Bolaji Shofoluwe. ETK is a market entry consultancy firm. Bolaji Shofoluwe, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. First time in the studio, but certainly not the first time on Channel's Business Global. You're a regular guest. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. You've been in the investments scene for several years now. Can you tell me the true impact of COVID-19? I'm guessing there are, of course, losers, but certainly some winners.
5 billion. That's the number of investments into the tech sector in Africa in the last year or so, which goes to show that COVID has actually prompted innovation on the continent. And the travel restrictions have only boosted businesses like ours, where there's the need for a presence on the ground. You know, there's no more sort of, you know, trying to run your African operations from a distance. You know, people are beginning to realize, even larger companies are beginning to realize they need to be closer to their customers. They need their supply chains to be a little bit more, need to be reorganized, if you like. And so there's a lot more near-shore manufacturing going on. So there's a huge investment going into the continent as a result of COVID-19.
You're talking about investors and your clients wanting to be closer to the action. Are there any apprehensions? Just heard this morning that the US have barred Ethiopia, Mali and I believe Guinea from accessing some of their free trade initiatives because of human rights violations. Is that fear still there and still palpable?
Of course. I mean, politics in Africa has always been slightly problematic. I mean, we know that leadership and leadership's, skills on the continent need to be developed tremendously. Again, some of these nations are fairly young, their democracies are evolving, and you're seeing quite a number of, a number of unstable or, stability issues around governance and the rest of it. And so these things will continue to happen. I think it's just a question of, how much time is invested in improving governance on the continent. So I think, you will hear pockets of stories like these as an ongoing trend, but I think largely governance is improving because there's accountability across the continent.
Hear, hear, we hope. I know that the ETK Group work quite closely with British trade departments, and recently the British Minister for Africa, Vicky Ford, announced in Chatham House that the UK needs to invest and build long-term partnerships in Africa. What do you envision these partnerships would look like?
So I really love to hear this kind of rhetoric coming from the government. The only thing is that we hope to see more action following policy. What we've seen recently is that the British government has been prioritising, richer nations or a relationship with richer nations for obvious reasons. Obviously, having left the EU, we're trying to establish lucrative relationships that would give us short-term returns. And Africa is more of a longer game, isn't it? So what I hope to see from this sort of policy direction is, a little bit more investment going into the continent, encouraging patient capital going in, supporting local businesses here in the UK to create joint ventures and long-term partnerships on the continent. That's what I'd really like to see.
Do you think some of us were a bit too over-optimistic about post-Brexit Britain's relationship with Africa? Nothing really appears to have kicked off, or do you think it's just too early yet?
I think, what was really interesting was that on the 1st of January last year, the Free Trade Area Agreement in Africa was, put into action, as well as the EU, Brexit, sort of the UK leaving the EU at the same time. And I found that really quite interesting because one was coming together and the other one was separating. And I think Britain's relationship with Africa needs to be a little bit more sophisticated. I think you still need to look at Africa as not one entity, but in the separate countries. And you need to look at investment policies for some of the countries across the continent quite differently. And so I think once policy starts to look at it from that perspective, I think you start to see some real results. But at the moment, it's a lot of rhetoric.
Is the trade scene competitive? When you're trying to, scramble for customers, do you find that it is difficult to keep up with your Chinese counterparts or the French counterparts? Do you think Britain can override some of the major milestones that China, for example, has achieved on the continent?
So a lot of people talk about China's influence in Africa and whether Britain can step up and take over that influence. But in my opinion, no one should have influence over Africa. Africa should have influence over Africa. And I think what we should be encouraging and what we should be looking at seeing a little bit more is, collaborations, tripartite collaborations, where you're finding the UK collaborating with China, maybe providing the technical expertise. China is providing the manufacturing, all the money to execute projects on the ground that benefit local people. I think that's what we need to be seeing more of. I think, sort of suggesting that Britain can, override China's influence on the continent usually suggests that, we're going into a second phase of colonialism. And, that's something that, African leaders are quite defensive about. They're protecting their ground, they're protecting their territory. Well, you could say most of them, there's a lot of trust that needs to be rebuilt across the continent. I think Africa sees China as more of a, as a country they can look up to, only because they were where the continent was, where the continent is now 30 years ago. And there was a massive economic revolution happening there. So I think, that is the reason why Africa and China work so well together. It's just because they understand each other better, I think.
Absolutely. Got a statistic here from you. Of the more than 2 billion people the UN expect to be born in 2050, more than half will be African. Talking about leadership again, how can our institutions prepare for this population surge?
Well, when you have more people, you have to feed them, you have to educate them, and you have to allow them to move around. So I would say we need stronger agricultural infrastructure in Africa. We can feed ourselves on the continent. I mean, arable land is over 60% in the continent. So obviously, stronger agricultural infrastructure needs to be put in place. I think just general infrastructure, such as healthcare and the rest of it, also needs to be upgraded. But also, we need to start looking at how we educate these people and provide them with jobs. And I think there needs to be mass industrialization in Africa in order to provide those jobs. So I think, again, going back to the China example, we need to start thinking about some of those things. ETK is really excited about two major things. Number one would be our technology platform, sort of developing that further. That's a big priority for us this year, because a lot of the troubles that people have going into the continent is around information. And so we intend to provide more information on a granular level for businesses that are trying to get into the continent using our technology platform. The other thing that we're really excited about is the amount of expansion going on across the continent, particularly of African firms. So we talked about that 5 billion number. A lot of that investment has gone into organizations that are selling the Africa dream. So not just the Kenya dream or even the Nairobi dream. We're looking at the Africa dream. So expansion across is happening quite a bit. Intra-Africa migration is happening quite a bit. Intra-Africa trade is happening quite a bit. So ETK is really playing a role in sort of establishing these businesses across the continent as well. So our British customers, we're just trying to get them to follow suit, really, and to be a little bit more deliberate about their approach to Africa. So
Absolutely
really
wonderful.
exciting.
Yeah, so please keep us updated on Channels Business Global. Bolaji Shofoluwe, the Managing Director of the ETK Group. Thank you so much for joining me in this
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
In a few minutes, I'll be speaking with David Smith, but before then, here's some company news for you. Elizabeth Holmes, founder of the defunct blood testing group Theranos, has been convicted by a federal jury of defrauding investors. The 37-year-old disgraced entrepreneur was found guilty of 4 fraud charges for using her company into a sophisticated sham that duped investors and patients into backing revolutionary finger prick blood testing technology that never actually worked. The criminal trial shone a spotlight on Silicon Valley's fake it until you make it culture. Holmes is now facing up to 20 years in prison for each count. The Consumer Electronics Show opened its doors to thousands of visitors in Las Vegas earlier this week, despite high-profile firms such as Amazon, Google, Meta and TikTok pulling out due to COVID-19 fears. Despite the smaller crowd, innovations in electronics transportation and space-related technologies are expected to garner plenty of attention. Organisers are anticipating between 50 and 75,000 attendees. Staying with the CES Tech Show, the Sony Group has unveiled a prototype 7-seat electric sport utility vehicle as bosses explore entering the increasingly competitive EV market. During an announcement, the company said it would establish a company called Sony Mobility Inc. in the spring, which sent its share price up by more than 4.5%. The Japanese firm has been testing its electric vehicles on public roads in Europe for over a year and has also begun verification tests of the safety and user experience. Now let's stay with our topic on Africa's economic expansion in the coming year by speaking with David Smith. He's the chairman of the British African Business Alliance and he joins me from Macclesfield. David Smith, it's always a pleasure to welcome you on Channels Business Global. It's been a challenging 2 years. How have businesses within the British African Business Alliance network coped with the pandemic?
Oh, it's been a challenge, definitely. We've seen all sorts of different reactions and attitudes coming through our membership. There are people who have completely lost their way, specifically in the areas of tourism and travel. And yet they've found strength and energy to continue to look at what the future might be. So from that side, interesting. More generally, we found people who've suddenly found time. Their 9 to 5 traditional revenue streams have faltered in some way, and they have refocused on bringing forward projects related to Africa. So we've seen an influx of new projects. And I think as the COVID has spread around and the waves have been different in different places, we've seen people responding positively to that in different areas at different times.
Absolutely. Before the break, I was speaking to Bolaji Shofoluwe, who works extensively with the British government in terms of exporting and importing. And recently, we heard from the British Minister for Africa, Vicky Ford, basically saying that Britain needs to do more. More investment in Africa is needed. Do you think...
Absolutely, it does.
Yeah, Please, David.
It certainly does, and it needs to happen at multiple levels. I hear consistently the cries for the requirements for infrastructure, but the way technology is leapfrogging all the time, any village in Nigeria and certainly any village in Africa could have the power, the water, and the communications that we enjoy here in the UK. Now, that's technology coming out of the UK that needs to find partners to go into Africa, because a small company here cannot possibly put in place the sort of infrastructure and management control that that sort of development requires. So I see it as a huge opportunity for the African community in the UK. They're all living in a very fragmented distribution across the country. But immediately in their vicinity, there are UK businesses that could be working in Africa if they had someone to act as a trade ambassador, to act as a partner, to act as a guide on how best to go there and what the markets in Africa currently require.
So what are some of the stumbling blocks then, Dave? Because I know that's exactly what you're doing with the British African Business Alliance. I know that's what Bolaji's doing with the ETK group. Do you think perhaps some of us in the diaspora have overplayed Brexit, suggesting that, of course, you know, Africa, Nigeria in particular, could be the solution to the loss of the EU, when actually it's not going to be that simple?
It's not going to be simple because I think there are a lot of sort of predefined and historic concepts that sit in the way. I certainly can't see a typical finance director releasing the sorts of budgets that you would need to go and set up a business in Nigeria. Not many companies can afford to do that. And likewise, any country, it's going to be a considerable investment. So I think that what's got to happen is there's got to be an open door of communication between UK businesses that are looking for new markets and those merchant adventurers from Africa who are here in the UK at the moment, who can spot an opportunity, understand the sector, understand the working practices of the UK organisations, and then can negotiate the process of bringing stuff in. I mean, as an example, last 2019, we put together a politician from Zimbabwe, a technology company from Reading, and a diaspora person from Bradford. That has turned into a $120 million deal. Now, those sorts of things can only happen if people start talking to each other.
Absolutely. Talking together and communication is crucial, but also telecommunications and being digital is crucial. It's suggested, David, that around 85% of Africa's economic activity is generated in the informal sector. How can this change? Have you also seen within your network this kind of sluggish or some haphazard attitude towards going online? Because that's where everybody is, isn't it, really?
It is, but I think there are some fundamental issues here, and it's something that we're coming up again and again, against again and again, and that is the $1 million startup. The market is there, the resources is there, the opportunity is there. It can be well expressed in a business plan, but fundamentally an investor then has to put $1 million on the table to make it work. And in a startup scenario, that is really difficult to do. So coming back onto Vicky Ford's point about partnership, where we can bring a technology company or where we can bring management expertise from an existing organization and build a partnership onto that that is African owned, that is owned by Nigerians or by Zambians or by Kenyans or whoever, then those UK companies can provide a sort of backbone to the deal that gives the investor confidence.
Absolutely.
There's certainly no shortage of money for Africa at the moment.
No. Before I let you go, David, very briefly, I've got to ask you, you know, continent-wide, where is, what's piquing your interest? Which country or region do you think investors and, you know, even yourself are looking at in the coming year?
I have to say that we're looking on a Pan-African basis. We see opportunities in Mozambique, we see opportunities in Namibia, in Ethiopia, in South Sudan. Nigeria, of course, is a real driver. And I think that's where a lot of work needs to be done to sort of bring forward things. The real area of focus for me recently has been GDP per head. And through work we're doing on a major infrastructure project in Nigeria, we're looking at the GDP per head within each state. Now, from that position forward, you then start to compare things. Nigeria is 19th on the continent. It has 20%, just under 20% of GDP per head for the world. So, the world is 11,000, Nigeria is 2,000. Nigeria needs to grow 5 times to become a world average country. Now, that's quite a difficult thing to get your head around, even in an interview like this.
Especially when we're running out of time, David. I think you're looking for another slot,
but
aren't you?
How else will you create the jobs unless
Absolutely.
you bring the SMEs that will employ the people and build the communities that create the environment where this growing population is going to live?
No, absolutely. There are so many dots, aren't there, and so many jigsaw pieces that need to be full. We've run out of time. David Smith, Chairman of the British African Business Alliance. Next time I've got to have you in the studio so we can spend more time kind of scrambling
Love to do that.
The resolution to Africa's financial woes, and I'm sure we will get the solution soon. David Smith, thanks so much for joining me on the show. Thank you, David. Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.